April 12, 1819, and the dawn light filtered through the curved glass panels of the orangery at Ravensmere Estate, casting geometric patterns across the stone floor where Eleanor Fairfax moved quietly among the potted lemon trees, her worn morning dress the colour of faded lavender, her hands gentle as she inspected the waxy leaves for signs of scale or blight. This hour belonged to her alone, the single portion of each day when she was not Miss Fairfax the governess, not the shadow in the schoolroom or the invisible presence at the edge of drawing-rooms, but simply Eleanor, a woman who loved the sharp citrus scent and the way morning transformed glass and greenery into something luminous. She had discovered this sanctuary 3 years ago, shortly after arriving at the estate to teach the Duke's nieces, and in all that time no one had disturbed these solitary visits, for the household did not wake before 7, and the orangery was considered merely decorative, an architectural flourish left over from the previous Duke's fondness for fashionable botany. Eleanor knew herself to be plain, had long ago accepted the arithmetic of her face, with its too wide mouth and too narrow eyes, her figure neither gracefully slender nor fashionably curved, but simply unremarkable, her brown hair refusing to curl no matter the application of rags or irons, and her complexion tending toward sallowness despite the bloom of roses powder she could not afford in any case. She was 28 years old. A gentleman's daughter fallen into necessity after her father's death had revealed debts rather than the modest competence she had imagined, and this position at Ravensmere represented security she dared not jeopardize, a roof and respectability and £40 per annum. The estate itself was magnificent, all golden Kentish stone and sprawling wings, with gardens that tumbled down to a small lake and woods beyond, the kind of beauty that had made her breath catch when she first arrived, though she had learned quickly that such beauty was not meant for her except as backdrop to her marginal existence. She was governess to Miss Clara and Miss Sophia Ashworth, 8 and 10 years old respectively, daughters of the Duke's late brother, orphaned 4 years past, and raised here under the guardianship of their uncle, who was too important and too busy to spare them much attention beyond ensuring they had proper instruction. Eleanor loved the girls fiercely, their bright minds and different temperaments, Clara all questions and energy, Sophia more reserved and musical, both of them affectionate in ways that made Eleanor's throat tighten with protective tenderness. But she knew her place, knew that she occupied the strange territory between servant and family, belonging fully to neither, taking her meals alone in the schoolroom, nodding politely when she encountered the housekeeper or the Duke's sister, Lady Beatrice, in the corridors, keeping her eyes down and her voice soft, and her presence as unobtrusive as possible. Here in the orangery, though, among the lemon trees with their delicate white blossoms and hard green fruit, she allowed herself to simply be, to breathe deeply and think her own thoughts, and remember that she had once been a girl who loved learning, who had read her father's books and imagined a different life entirely. The 14th of April dawned bright and unseasonably warm, and Eleanor stood at the schoolroom window with Clara and Sophia pressed against her sides, all three watching as a magnificent black carriage drawn by 4 matched greys swept up the curved drive, and Clara squealed that Uncle Thomas had come home, and Sophia asked why he had not sent word ahead, and Eleanor felt her stomach tighten with an apprehension she could not name as the household below erupted into sudden activity, footmen rushing out to attend the carriage, maids appearing in doorways, the housekeeper, Mrs. Whitmore, hurrying across the gravel with her keys jangling at her waist. The Duke of Ravensmere emerged from the carriage with the easy grace of a man accustomed to command, tall and broad-shouldered in his dark travelling coat, his hair black as coal and his features arranged in an expression of austere handsomeness that made Eleanor's breath catch even from this distance, though she told herself firmly that she was merely observing as one might observe a painting or a thoroughbred horse, appreciating beauty that had nothing to do with her own small existence. Clara was already racing toward the door, Sophia following more sedately, both girls crying that they must go greet their uncle, and Eleanor called after them to mind their manners and not throw themselves at his grace in a manner unbecoming young ladies, though she knew her words would have little effect once they reached him, for Thomas Ashworth was the closest thing to a father they possessed. She remained at the window, watching as the girls burst from the house and Thomas caught Clara up in his arms, then bent to embrace Sophia, his severe expression transforming briefly into something warmer before settling back into its habitual gravity. And Eleanor thought how young he had been when he inherited, only 24 when his older brother died in a riding accident and left him with a dukedom, these orphaned nieces, an estate of thousands of acres, and the weight of expectations he had never been raised to bear. A second carriage arrived within the hour, this one containing Lady Beatrice Ashworth, the Duke's widowed sister, and Eleanor watched that reunion too, saw Beatrice speak urgently to her brother while gesturing toward the house, her sharp features animated with some intelligence that made Thomas's expression darken, and Eleanor withdrew from the window feeling the familiar sensation of her own invisibility settling over her like a well-worn cloak. The afternoon passed in unusual disorder, lessons abandoned as Clara and Sophia were summoned to take tea with their uncle in the drawing room, and Eleanor retreated to her small chamber adjacent to the schoolroom, listening to the sounds of trunks being carried upstairs, servants called to attend his grace, the housekeeper issuing rapid instructions about airing rooms and preparing dinners and ensuring everything met ducal standards. Later, when the girls returned flushed and chattering, they reported that Uncle Thomas had been in London on business for the Crown, something diplomatic and important they did not fully understand, and that he seemed tired and rather grim, and that Aunt Beatrice had arrived because she had news about Lady Isabella Pembroke, who had been Uncle Thomas's particular friend years ago before she married a French comte. And now there were rumours she might return to England, and was not that exciting, Miss Fairfax? And might there be a wedding at Ravensmere after all? Eleanor helped them prepare for bed with steady hands, while her mind caught on that name, Isabella Pembroke. And later, passing through the corridor near the servants' stair, she overheard two maids whispering about the great romance everyone had expected to end in betrothal before Lady Isabella had chosen the wealthier, more sophisticated Frenchman instead, breaking the Duke's heart. And now she was returning, and surely his Grace would want to see her, and would that not be the most romantic reunion imaginable? Eleanor climbed the stairs to her chamber, feeling the particular loneliness of her position settling into her bones, neither family nor servant, neither visible nor quite ignored, simply a functionary in a great house full of important people whose dramas and desires moved through spaces she would never enter. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber brings us closer to 1,000, which helps us keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The library at Ravensmere occupied the entire east wing of the second floor, a magnificent room lined floor to ceiling with volumes bound in leather of every shade from deepest burgundy to pale cream, with tall windows overlooking the gardens and ladder-backed chairs positioned near the marble fireplace. And Eleanor entered on the afternoon of the 16th, carrying a list of texts she needed for the following week's natural history lessons, moving quietly as always, apologizing to the footman stationed at the door, though he barely acknowledged her presence. She had not expected to find anyone in residence at this hour, for the Duke would surely be occupied with estate business or entertaining his sister, but as she moved deeper into the room toward the section on scientific subjects, she heard the sound of drawers opening and closing with increasing frustration, and rounding the corner of a bookshelf, she discovered Thomas Ashworth himself standing before the large mahogany desk that dominated the center of the library, his coat discarded over a chair, his cravat loosened, papers scattered before him in apparent disarray. He looked up at her entrance, and for a moment they simply regarded each other, Eleanor frozen with the awareness of her intrusion into his private struggle. And then he straightened and offered a slight bow, his expression transforming from frustrated distraction into formal courtesy as he said, "Miss Fairfax, forgive me. I did not know you required the library this afternoon." She curtsied quickly, stammered that she merely needed to select a few volumes for the children's lessons and would not disturb him, but he waved away her apology and returned to his search, muttering something about his late brother's filing system being incomprehensible and estate documents vanishing into apparent nothingness when one most needed them. Eleanor moved to the natural history section, running her fingers along the spines, but found herself distracted by his presence, acutely aware of him in a way she had not been during the distant observation from the schoolroom window. For here in this enclosed space she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he raked one hand through his dark hair in frustration, and she thought how alone he seemed despite all the servants and family surrounding him, how the weight of responsibility sat visibly upon him. She had located 2 of the 3 books she required when he spoke again, asking if she were familiar with the organization of the library, and she turned to find him watching her with an expression of cautious hope, and she admitted that, yes, she had spent considerable time here over the past 3 years and had developed some understanding of the collection. He asked, rather humbly for a duke, if she might know where his brother had kept documents related to tenant agreements, and Eleanor found herself moving to the desk, suggesting that the late Duke had favored a locked drawer in the lower right corner for matters of business, and Thomas dropped to one knee and discovered the drawer she indicated, producing a key from his waistcoat and opening it to reveal precisely the papers he sought. The relief on his face was almost boyish as he stood, thanking her with genuine warmth, and then his gaze fell upon the books she held, and he asked what subject the girls were studying, and when she explained that they were learning to identify and categorize local plant species, his expression shifted into something more animated as he moved past her to the shelves and retrieved a volume bound in green morocco, saying that this particular text by a botanist named Curtis contained excellent hand-colored illustrations and might prove more engaging for young minds than the rather dry taxonomic approach of the book she had selected. Eleanor took the volume from his hands, their fingers not quite touching, and opened it, to discover he was absolutely correct. The illustrations were beautiful, and the text more accessible, and she looked up to thank him, and found him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch before he seemed to recall himself, and stepped back, resuming his formal manner. She curtsied again, gathered her books, and retreated from the library with her heart beating strangely fast. And as she climbed the stairs to the schoolroom, she reminded herself firmly of all the reasons that brief exchange meant nothing at all, that dukes did not notice governesses except as functionaries, that she was the daughter of an impoverished curate with no beauty to recommend her and no prospects beyond this position, which she must not jeopardize with foolish imaginings. But that evening, preparing the next day's lessons by candlelight in her small chamber, she found herself touching the green morocco binding of the book he had recommended, remembering the kindness in his voice, so different from Lady Beatrice's dismissive tones or the servant's polite indifference, and she allowed herself just a moment to wonder what it might be like to be seen, truly seen, by a man like Thomas Ashworth, before she closed the book and extinguished that dangerous thought along with her candle. Eleanor took her solitary dinner in the schoolroom, as she always did, a tray sent up by the kitchen containing simple fare that she ate while reviewing the next day's lesson plans. But on this evening of the 17th of April, her concentration faltered repeatedly as she listened to the sounds drifting up from below, the clink of fine crystal and china, the murmur of conversation and occasional laughter from the formal dining room where the Duke entertained his sister and presumably discussed matters far removed from verb conjugations and botanical classifications. Clara and Sophia arrived shortly after 8 to prepare for bed. Both girls flushed with the excitement of having been permitted to join the adults for the first course, and they chatted as Eleanor helped them into their night dresses, reporting that Uncle Thomas had announced the most wonderful news, that Lady Isabella Pembroke would be arriving at Ravensmere within a fortnight, and Aunt Beatrice had clapped her hands together and said it was about time, and Uncle Thomas had looked rather serious, but had agreed that, yes, Isabella's return to England was confirmed. Eleanor brushed Sophia's hair with steady strokes, while the girl speculated about whether Lady Isabella was as beautiful as everyone said, and Clara chimed in that Aunt Beatrice had told them Lady Isabella had been practically engaged to Uncle Thomas years ago before she went to France. And would it not be romantic if they married now, and might there be a wedding with cake and new dresses? Eleanor made appropriately neutral responses, settled both girls into their beds, heard their prayers, and extinguished all but one candle before retreating to her own small chamber adjacent to the schoolroom, where she sat on the edge of her narrow bed and felt the weight of information she had no right to find distressing. She rose after a moment and moved to her wash-basin, pouring cold water and pressing dampened hands to her face, catching her reflection in the small mirror and cataloguing once again the features she had long since accepted with resignation: the too wide mouth, the unremarkable brown eyes, the hair that was neither fashionably dark nor attractively fair, but rather a middling shade that defied description, the figure that was too tall and too angular to ever be called graceful. Through the walls she could hear the muffled voices of servants moving through the corridors, and then closer, right outside her door, the distinctive sharp tones of Lady Beatrice's lady's maid speaking to one of the housemaids, and Eleanor froze as their conversation carried clearly through the thin wood, the lady's maid saying that Lady Isabella's situation was indeed tragic, widowed after only 3 years of marriage to the Comte, who had been killed in some political violence, and the housemaid asking in hushed tones whether it was true about the great romance between her ladyship and the Duke, and the lady's maid confirming that, yes, everyone had expected a betrothal 5 years ago, the families were in complete agreement, but then the Comte had pursued Lady Isabella with continental sophistication and a larger fortune, and she had chosen him instead, breaking the Duke's heart so thoroughly that he had thrown himself into diplomatic service abroad for 2 years to recover from the pain of it. The voices faded as the servants moved on, but Eleanor remained standing motionless in her chamber, feeling something she had no right to feel, a peculiar ache in her chest that she recognized as the death of a hope she had not even consciously permitted herself to nurture. For what had she imagined? That a chance encounter in the library and a moment of kindness over a botanical text had meant anything at all beyond a duke being gracious to a servant in his household? She had learned long ago, in the years after her father's death when she had been forced to seek employment, that women in her position survived by accepting their place without complaint, by finding contentment in small mercies, by never ever allowing themselves to want what they could not have. As darkness settled fully outside her window, Eleanor wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and slipped quietly down the back stairs and out through the garden door, walking the gravel paths in the dusk, while the windows of the great house glowed behind her with warm light that seemed to emphasize her exile from such brightness, and she acknowledged to herself with brutal honesty that the flutter she had felt during that library encounter had been the beginning of something foolish and dangerous, and she crushed it now with deliberate force, reminding herself of every lesson she had learned about hope and its costs, and by the time she returned to her chamber and climbed into her bed, she had restored the careful resignation that had protected her for so long, though it seemed somehow heavier now and far less like protection than like loss. Ellen awoke on the morning of the 19th of April, with the heaviness of the previous evening still pressing upon her chest, and though she had resolved not to return to the orangery, not to seek out those moments of solitary peace that had become complicated by the memory of kindness she could not afford to treasure, she found herself rising in the darknesses before dawn, as habit compelled her, dressing in her plain grey morning dress and wrapping her shawl against the spring chill, and descending the back stairs while the house still slept in that peculiar silence that precedes the stirring of servants and the beginning of another day of duties. She told herself she would walk the kitchen gardens instead, but her feet carried her without conscious decision along the gravel path toward the glass structure that glowed faintly in the pre-dawn light. And when she opened the door and stepped into the humid warmth, fragrant with citrus and earth, she did not expect to find Thomas Ashworth standing among the potted lemon trees with his coat collar turned up against the cold he had evidently been standing in for some time, his dark hair slightly disordered, and his expression so unguarded in the moment before he noticed her presence that she saw clearly the exhaustion and something else, something like loneliness that mirrored her own. He turned at the sound of the door, and his entire countenance changed, relief flooding his features as he said her name, Miss Fairfax, with such evident gladness that she felt her careful defences tremble, and she curtsied and began to apologize for intruding upon his solitude. But he crossed the space between them quickly and said he had been walking the grounds since before midnight, unable to sleep, and had hoped she might come here as was her custom, and might they speak for a moment if she could spare the time. Eleanor found herself nodding, though every instinct warned her to retreat, and they moved by unspoken agreement to the small iron bench near the largest of the lemon trees, where the first pale light was beginning to filter through the glass panes above, and he asked after his nieces with genuine interest, and she found herself speaking more freely than she intended about Clara's progress in mathematics and Sophia's emerging gift for languages, about their different temperaments and how she tried to nurture each girl's particular strengths rather than forcing them into identical molds. And as she spoke, she watched his face and saw that he was truly listening, not with the polite inattention of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but with focused attention that made her feel as though her words mattered, as though she mattered. He asked thoughtful questions, remembered details from previous conversations she had not realized he had attended to, and then he said something that surprised her, that his nieces were fortunate to have an instructor who saw them as individuals rather than merely pupils to be drilled in accomplishments, and she replied that surely all good teachers approached their charges thus, and he shook his head and told her of his own childhood education, the brutal tutors and rigid expectations, the sense that he existed only to fulfill his family's requirements, and never as a person with his own thoughts and feelings. And she heard in his voice an echo of her own experience of being unseen. And without thinking she said that, yes, she understood what it meant to be valued only for one's function, and never for oneself. The words hung between them in the warming air, more intimate than she had intended, and he turned to look at her directly, and she saw that his eyes were not the cold grey she had thought from a distance, but rather a complex shade that held both warmth and sorrow, and he said quietly that he suspected she understood a great many things that others missed, and she felt heat rise to her face and looked away toward the lemon trees with their dark leaves and pale fruit. And then he asked her what had brought her to Ravensmere 3 years ago, and she found herself telling him what she rarely spoke of, her father's death from fever when she was 24, the discovery that his living had provided barely enough for survival and nothing for his daughter's future, the necessity of seeking employment and the gradual understanding that women of her birth and education, but without beauty or connections, had limited paths available, and how she had been grateful, genuinely grateful, to secure this position in a great house where she was treated with basic decency and the children were kind. He listened without interruption until she finished, and then he said something that pierced through all her careful resignation. He said that she spoke as though she were grateful for scraps when she deserved a feast, and before she could respond to words that threatened to undo her entirely, the orangery door opened and a footman appeared, looking flustered, begging the Duke's pardon, but his steward required urgent consultation about a matter with the tenant farms, and Thomas rose with visible reluctance, told Eleanor he hoped they might continue this conversation another time, and then he was gone, leaving her alone among the lemon trees with her heart beating strangely and something shifting inside her that felt dangerous and inevitable, like spring growth that could not be contained, no matter how one might wish to preserve the safety of winter dormancy. Over the following days, in that peculiar span of time between the 20th and the 26th of April, Eleanor became aware of Thomas Ashworth's presence in spaces she occupied with a frequency that could not be attributed to coincidence, and she found herself in a state of perpetual bewilderment that warred with the caution she knew she must maintain. He appeared in the library on the morning of the 21st, while she searched for a volume of French poetry for Sophia's lessons, and instead of the brief exchange she expected, he remained, asking her opinion on a translation of Rousseau she had mentioned during their orangery conversation, and they spoke for nearly 20 minutes about philosophy and education, while spring light streamed through the tall windows and illuminated the dust motes floating between them like visible proof of something suspended and shimmering in the air. That afternoon, she walked with Clara and Sophia through the gardens, as was their custom, following lunch, the girls gathering specimens for their nature journals, and Thomas appeared on the path, as though his presence there were the most natural thing in the world, and he walked with them for the better part of an hour, asking the girls about their findings and listening with genuine interest as Clara explained the difference between the emerging leaves of oak and ash, and Eleanor felt his gaze on her repeatedly, and when their eyes met, she saw something in his expression that made her breath catch, and her careful composure threatened to dissolve entirely. On the 23rd, she brought the girls to the music room for Sophia's pianoforte practice, and Thomas arrived perhaps 10 minutes later, claiming he had been passing and heard the music, and he sat in one of the chairs near the instrument and listened while Sophia played her scales and then a simple Mozart piece, and when the girl finished, he praised her genuinely and then asked Eleanor if she played, and when she admitted that yes, her father had taught her, though she had little opportunity for practice now, he insisted she play something, and she found herself at the instrument with his attention focused entirely upon her, while her fingers moved across the keys in a Handel air she had loved as a girl. And when she finished, there was a moment of profound silence before he said quietly that it was beautiful. She was beautiful when she played, and then seemed to realize what he had said and looked away, and Eleanor felt heat flood her face and something dangerous bloom in her chest, despite every warning her mind issued. The conversations between them lengthened and deepened, moving beyond polite exchanges into territory that felt increasingly intimate. And he began to ask her opinions not just on books and education, but on matters of beauty and meaning, on what she thought made a life well lived, on whether she believed happiness was a matter of circumstance or choice. And she found herself responding with a honesty she had never offered another person, her true thoughts emerging as though he had created a space where pretense was unnecessary, and his attention felt like sunlight after years of shadow, warming parts of herself she had learned to keep carefully cold. But Lady, Beatrice noticed, and on the afternoon of the 25th she encountered Eleanor in the corridor outside the schoolroom and delivered a cutting remark about governesses who forgot their station, suggesting that Eleanor seemed to have developed ideas above her place, and though the words were delivered with a smile, their meaning was unmistakable, and Eleanor curtsied and murmured an apology, and retreated to her chamber, where she sat trembling with the collision of hope and self-protection, knowing that she was allowing herself to feel things she had no right to feel, to want things that could never be hers, yet finding herself unable to stop the tide of emotion that Thomas's presence and attention had unleashed, and she recognized with growing clarity that she was in terrible danger of loving a man so far above her station that the very thought was a form of madness. Yet when she closed her eyes, she saw his face and heard his voice saying her name, and the war within her between hope and resignation had never been more fierce or more likely to destroy her. Lady Isabella Pembroke arrived at Ravensmere on the afternoon of the 27th of April in a carriage that bore the faded remnants of aristocratic grandeur, and Eleanor watched from the schoolroom window with Clara and Sophia pressed beside her as the household assembled in the courtyard below to receive the woman whose name had haunted the estate like a ghost given substance. And when Isabella stepped down from the carriage, Eleanor felt her breath stop because the woman was breathtakingly beautiful in a way that made Eleanor understand with crushing clarity the vast distance between herself and those whom society deemed worthy of attention. Isabella's hair gleaming gold, even in the grey afternoon light, her figure elegant despite the travelling clothes, her bearing that of someone accustomed to admiration and deference. And Thomas was there, striding forward to greet her, and even from the distance of the upper window Eleanor could see the emotion on his face, something between shock and recognition, and what might have been tenderness. And she watched as Isabella reached for his hands, and he took them, and they stood thus for a long moment, before he handed her down and led her toward the house, while Beatrice followed, and servants scurried with luggage, and the entire household seemed to reorganize itself around this luminous presence. The girls chattered excitedly, asking who the beautiful lady was, and Eleanor forced her voice to steadiness as she explained that Lady Isabella was an old friend of their uncle's, someone he had known years ago who had been living in France, and Sophia said with innocent delight that perhaps Uncle Thomas would marry her because she was so very pretty, and Eleanor felt something crack inside her chest, but she smiled and said that marriage was a matter for adults to decide, and they should return to their lessons, though she could not afterward remember what she taught them in the remaining hour before their supper. That evening, Eleanor took her solitary meal in the schoolroom, as always, but the sounds of the house below were different, animated conversation drifting up from the dining room where she knew Thomas and Beatrice dined with Isabella. And when Clara and Sophia returned from their own meal, they were full of whispered intelligence gleaned from the maids, speaking with the oblivious cruelty of children about how Lady Isabella had fled France because her husband had died and left her in a delicate condition, and Beatrice's maid had told the kitchen staff that Isabella had nowhere to go because her own family had disowned her for the scandal of bearing a child out of proper mourning, and surely the Duke would rescue her because everyone knew they had been attached years ago before she married the French comte, and Eleanor listened with her hands folded tightly in her lap and her face carefully composed, while something that had barely begun to live inside her withered and died. After the girls were settled for the night, Eleanor descended to the garden in the dusk, needing air and movement to contain the chaos in her chest, and she walked the paths she had walked with Thomas only days before, when his attention had made her feel visible, and she saw through the terrace windows the drawing-room where Isabella sat at the pianoforte, playing something Eleanor could not hear while Thomas stood nearby watching. And even in silhouette, their figures seemed to belong together in a way that Eleanor knew she never could, and she acknowledged to herself with brutal honesty that she had been a fool to allow his kindness to touch her, to permit herself even the shadow of hope, because this was the truth she had always known, that men like Thomas Ashworth married women like Isabella Pembroke, women of beauty and breeding whose presence graced the elegant rooms of great houses, while women like Eleanor Fairfax remained in the margins teaching other people's children and learning to be grateful for small mercies. And the pain of this truth was sharper now than it had ever been, because for a brief span of days she had forgotten it, and now she must learn resignation all over again. Except this time it hurt infinitely more, because she knew what it felt like to be seen. Thomas Ashworth disappeared from Eleanor's orbit entirely in the days following Isabella's arrival, and the absence felt more profound than any presence she had known. As though something that had briefly illuminated her world had been extinguished and left her in darkness deeper than before, because now she knew what light felt like. The 28th of April passed, then the 29th, then the 30th, each day blurring into the next as Eleanor moved through her duties with mechanical precision, teaching Clara and Sophia their lessons, though she could not afterward recall what subjects they had covered, taking her solitary meals in the schoolroom while the sounds of animated conversation drifted up from the dining room below where Thomas and Beatrice entertained Isabella, the laughter and music reaching Eleanor like reports from a country she would never be permitted to enter. Isabella had been installed in the finest guest chambers in the family wing, the rose suite that Eleanor had glimpsed once during her first week at Ravensmere, and never entered again, and the household treated the beautiful widow with the deference due to family, servants hurrying to meet her requests, Beatrice spending hours in her company, Thomas constantly summoned to attend to some matter or provide some assistance, and Eleanor understood that the shape of the future was being formed in those elegant rooms where she did not belong. On the afternoon of the 1st of May, she stood in the corridor outside the morning room, waiting to speak with Beatrice about arrangements for the girl's music master. When she heard voices within, Beatrice speaking with urgent insistence about duty and obligation, saying that Isabella was quality, that her child would carry French noble blood, that the scandal of her situation could be remedied entirely if Thomas would simply do what everyone expected and marry her, restore her reputation, and gain a ready-made heir. And surely he remembered the attachment they had shared before she married the Comte. Surely he could see that Providence had returned her to him for a purpose, and Thomas's voice responding but too low for Eleanor to distinguish words, only the tone of weariness and something that might have been resignation. And Eleanor turned away without delivering her message, her hands trembling and her breath short. The girls began asking why Uncle Thomas no longer visited their lessons, why he did not walk with them in the gardens anymore, and Eleanor had no answer that would not reveal too much, so she distracted them with additional activities and projects, keeping them busy and herself exhausted, so she would not have time to think about dawn conversations in the orangery, or the way he had looked at her when she played Handel, or the words he had spoken about her deserving a feast instead of scraps, words that now seemed like cruelty, though she knew he had not meant them thus. On the evening of the 3rd of May, as dusk settled over the estate, and Eleanor stood at her chamber window looking out over the gardens, she saw Thomas and Isabella walking the terrace below, his dark head bent toward her golden one, her hand on his arm, their figures moving slowly along the stone balustrade, and the sight struck Eleanor with physical force, stealing her breath and sending pain radiating through her chest, and she turned away and sat on her narrow bed in the growing darkness and acknowledged what she had always known, what she should never have forgotten. I am the story no one tells, the woman who exists in the margins of other people's lives, teaching their children and tending their households and remaining invisible, except as a function to be performed, and my plainness and my birth and my position have marked me as surely as a brand. And I was a fool to believe even for a moment that a man like Thomas Ashworth could see me as anything other than a governess who provided pleasant conversation to fill empty morning hours before the real business of his life reclaimed him. She stopped going to the orangery at dawn, could not bear the memories that lived in that space. The lemon trees and the iron table and the glass walls that had contained something she had almost believed was real. And she rose instead just early enough to prepare for the day's lessons, performing her duties with the careful competence that had always defined her, accepting that this pain too would fade eventually into the dull ache of resignation she had carried for years before Thomas returned to Ravensmere and made her forget what she was. Thomas Ashworth appeared in the schoolroom doorway on the morning of the 6th of May without warning, his sudden presence startling Eleanor so completely that she dropped the slate she had been using to demonstrate arithmetic to Clara and Sophia, the sound of it clattering against the wooden floor cutting through the lesson like a thunderclap. And both girls turned to see their uncle standing there, with an expression Eleanor could not decipher, something urgent and searching in his eyes that made her heart begin to pound against her ribs with painful force. He apologized for the interruption in a voice that seemed strained, asked if he might speak with Miss Fairfax privately for a moment, and Eleanor felt her hands trembling as she instructed the girls to continue working on their sums, following Thomas into the corridor with her mind racing through possibilities, each more terrifying than the last, wondering if he had come to tell her she must leave because her presence complicated matters with Isabella, or perhaps to explain that he would be announcing his betrothal and wanted to inform her directly out of some misguided kindness. In the corridor he turned to face her, standing closer than propriety suggested, and she could see shadows beneath his eyes as though he had not slept properly in days. And he began speaking quickly, words tumbling over one another as he said he owed her an apology for his absence, that he had been managing complicated matters regarding Isabella's situation and his family's expectations, that he had not intended to simply disappear from her life without explanation, and his eyes searched hers with an intensity that made her breath catch because she had convinced herself she would never see him look at her this way again. He seemed about to say something more, something that made his whole body lean toward her with urgency, when the sound of footsteps on the stairs interrupted them and Isabella appeared at the landing, beautiful even in morning dress, her golden hair catching the light from the corridor windows, and she moved toward them with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes, placing her hand on Thomas's arm with familiar intimacy, and saying in her musical voice that she was so sorry to interrupt, but she desperately needed his assistance with a letter to her solicitor regarding the settlement he had so generously offered, and Eleanor watched as Thomas's jaw tightened, as something that might have been frustration or anger flickered across his face before he smoothed it into courtesy, and he looked at Eleanor with what seemed like desperation and said they would continue this conversation later. And then Isabella was leading him away down the corridor, glancing back once at Eleanor with an expression of cool assessment that made Eleanor feel every inch of her plainness and insignificance. She returned to the schoolroom in a state of confusion, her composure barely maintained as she guided the girls through the remainder of their lessons, her mind replaying every word Thomas had spoken, every nuance of his expression, trying to understand what it meant that he had sought her out, that he had looked at her as though her opinion mattered, as though her absence from his days had registered as loss, and she did not know whether to allow hope to kindle again or to protect herself against further pain. That evening, as dusk settled over Ravensmere, and Eleanor sat in her small chamber trying to focus on preparing the next day's lessons, she heard a soft sound at her door, and found when she opened it a folded piece of paper that had been slipped beneath, and her hands shook as she unfolded it to see Thomas's distinctive handwriting, the message brief but devastating in its effect on her carefully constructed defenses. Please resume your morning visits to the orangery. I find I miss encountering you there. She read the words again and again until they blurred before her eyes, and she pressed the paper against her chest as though she could somehow absorb the meaning deeper, and she acknowledged to herself that despite every warning her reason offered, despite the impossibility of the situation and the pain that surely awaited her, She would go to the orangery at dawn tomorrow, because she was not strong enough to resist the possibility that perhaps she had not been wrong to hope after all. Eleanor woke before dawn on the morning of the 7th of May, with Thomas's note still pressed beneath her pillow where she had placed it the night before, and she rose in the darkness and dressed with hands that trembled slightly, choosing her plainest morning dress as though armor against disappointment. And she made her way through the silent corridors of Ravensmere and across the dewy lawn to the orangery as the sky began to lighten from black to deep blue, pushing open the glass door to find Thomas already there, standing beside the small iron table where he had set out a tea service that steamed gently in the cool morning air, and the sight of him waiting for her with such evident care made something crack open in her chest that she had been holding closed through sheer force of will. He turned at the sound of her entrance, and his face transformed with relief so profound that Eleanor understood he had genuinely feared she would not come, and he said he had been here every morning since she stopped appearing, hoping each dawn that she would return, and there was no artifice in his voice, no practiced charm of the sort she imagined men of his station deployed when they wanted something, only raw honesty that made her throat tighten with emotion she did not dare name. They sat together at the iron table as they had before Isabella's arrival. But everything felt different now, weighted with things unsaid and questions unasked, and Thomas poured tea for them both, with hands that were not quite steady, before he began to speak about feeling suffocated by expectations, by the assumptions everyone made about what he should do regarding Isabella's situation. By the way, his sister and his servants and society all seemed to have decided his future without consulting him about what he actually wanted. And Eleanor listened with her teacup warming her cold hands and her heart beating too fast as she tried to understand what he was telling her and why he was telling her these things that seemed too intimate for a duke to share with his niece's governess. He asked about her life before Ravensmere, and the question surprised her because no one ever asked about her past, as though she had simply materialized in the schoolroom fully formed with no history or hopes or losses of her own, and she found herself telling him carefully about her father's death 6 years ago, the curate who had loved books and learning and had taught her Latin and Greek and philosophy in their small rectory, about how his passing had left her alone with no income and no prospects except to seek a position, about how Lady Beatrice had hired her, and how she had been grateful for this place and this work, because it was so much better than the alternatives available to impoverished gentlewomen with no connections, and she spoke of gratitude as though it were the highest blessing she could expect from life. And Thomas set down his teacup and leaned forward, and looked at her with such intensity that she could not look away. And he said something that struck her like a physical blow. "You speak as though you are grateful for scraps when you deserve a feast." And Eleanor could not breathe, could not form words, could only stare at him as the morning light strengthened around them and made the lemon trees cast long shadows across the stone floor and illuminated his face with its expression of something that looked almost like anguish, as though her resignation to so little pained him in ways she could not begin to understand. The meetings in the orangery became as necessary to Eleanor as breathing, the rhythm of their dawns together establishing itself with such naturalness that by the 3rd morning after their reconciliation she found herself waking before the sun with a sense of anticipation that felt both terrifying and inevitable, and she would dress quickly in the darkness and make her way through the sleeping house to find Thomas always already there among the lemon trees with tea prepared, and that expression on his face when she entered that made her feel seen in ways she had never experienced in all her 28 years of moving through the world, as though she were made of shadow rather than flesh. They spoke of everything in those stolen hours as dawn light gradually transformed the orangery from a space of darkness punctuated by lantern glow into a golden sanctuary. where the scent of citrus blossoms surrounded them like a benediction, and Thomas told her about inheriting the dukedom at 24 when his older brother Edward died in a riding accident, about the suffocating weight of responsibility that had descended on him when he was still barely more than a boy himself, about years of diplomatic service undertaken because duty required it, but which had left him exhausted and lonely in ways he had not fully understood, until these mornings with her showed him what it felt like to be himself rather than simply the Duke of Ravensmere. Eleanor found herself sharing things she had never spoken of to anyone, her love of botanical studies that she pursued through borrowed books and careful observation of the estate gardens, her joy in teaching Clara and Sophia, which came not just from duty, but from genuine delight in watching young minds unfold and discover the world, her memories of her father teaching her Greek philosophy in their small rectory, and telling her that she had the finest mind he had ever encountered, and that it was a tragedy the world would never allow her to use it fully because she had been born female and without fortune. And Thomas listened to every word with an intensity of attention that made her feel as though her thoughts and dreams mattered as much as the thoughts and dreams of duchesses and ladies who moved through the world with confidence Eleanor had never possessed. On the morning of the 12th of May, Thomas brought her a gift wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, and when Eleanor opened it with trembling hands, she discovered a rare botanical volume, an illustrated treatise on the cultivation of citrus trees in northern climates that she had mentioned wanting to read during one of their conversations, and she looked up at him with tears in her eyes, because no one had ever listened carefully enough to remember what she loved or cared enough to procure it for her, and he said simply that he had sent to London for it because he wanted her to have beautiful things. And their conversations had shifted gradually over these mornings from the careful formality of their first exchanges to something far more intimate, sharing childhood memories and private fears and thoughts about poetry and philosophy that felt like the most natural communion Eleanor had ever experienced, and they had begun to laugh together over small absurdities and to fall into comfortable silences that felt as meaningful as speech. And on the morning of the 14th of May, as they both reached for the teapot, at the same moment their hands brushed and neither of them pulled away immediately, and Eleanor felt the warmth of his skin against hers, and looked up to find him watching her with an expression that made her breath stop entirely. And the charge between them in that moment felt undeniable and vast, and more frightening than anything Eleanor had ever encountered, because she understood with sudden, devastating clarity that what was growing between them in this orangery at dawn was not friendship or kindness, but something far more dangerous. And when Thomas finally moved his hand away and resumed pouring tea, his fingers were not quite steady, and neither of them spoke for a long moment, while the morning bird song filtered through the glass walls, and Eleanor tried to quiet her racing heart, and failed completely. But Isabella's presence haunted the estate like an exquisite ghost, moving through the drawing rooms and corridors with a grace that reminded everyone of what a duchess should look like. And Eleanor would hear the pianoforte in the evenings as Isabella performed pieces by Mozart and Beethoven with technical brilliance that made the assembled guests gasp with appreciation. And she would stand in the schoolroom above, with her plain hands folded, and feel the distance between herself and that world as vast as an ocean she could never cross. Isabella was charm itself when Eleanor glimpsed her in passing, always beautifully dressed despite her condition, her pregnancy now visible in a way that somehow made her seem more rather than less ethereal. And she had a way of touching Thomas's arm when she spoke to him, and laughing at memories of their youth that made Eleanor's chest tighten with something that felt like drowning. Society callers descended on Ravensmere with increasing frequency, ladies who took tea in the drawing room and whose voices would drift up to where Eleanor worked with Clara and Sophia, and she heard the whispers that were meant to be whispers, but carried perfectly well through the old house. How noble the Duke would be if he married poor Lady Isabella and gave her child a name. How romantic that his first love had returned to him in her hour of greatest need. How it was clearly meant to be after all these years, and Eleanor would continue passing Latin with Sophia or reviewing watercolors with Clara and pretend that each word did not land like a stone against her ribs. On the morning of the 20th of May, Eleanor descended to the library earlier than usual to retrieve a history volume and passed by the study where Thomas met with his man of business, and she heard through the partially open door a conversation about settlements and provisions, about making arrangements for a child to be raised as an Ashworth with full rights of inheritance if the Duke should have no other sons, and though she did not hear Thomas agree to anything, the mere fact of the discussion felt like the closing of a door she had foolishly allowed herself to believe might open, and she stood frozen in the corridor with her hand pressed to her mouth and her eyes burning and her heart breaking in a way that felt both surprising and inevitable, because of course this was how it would end. Of course she had been a fool to imagine those mornings in the orangery meant anything beyond a duke's kindness to a lonely employee. She resolved in that moment to protect herself, to rebuild the walls she had allowed to crumble during those dawn conversations, to return to the resigned contentment she had known before Thomas had looked at her as though she mattered. And when she appeared in the orangery the next morning, she kept her responses brief and her eyes averted, and her entire demeanor locked back into the careful neutrality of a governess who knew her place. Thomas noticed immediately. She could see it in the way his face shifted from pleasure at her arrival to confusion, and then to something that looked like pain. And he asked her what had changed, why she was retreating from him, his voice holding a note of frustration that made her want simultaneously to weep and to run. But she only said that nothing had changed, that perhaps they had both allowed the conversations to become too familiar, and it was better to remember what was proper. And he set down his teacup with enough force that it rattled against the saucer, and said with barely controlled emotion, "Why do you retreat from me, Eleanor?" And she could not answer honestly, could not tell him that she was trying to survive what was coming, so she said nothing at all and left the orangery. While dawn was still breaking and did not look back, even though she felt his eyes following her all the way across the lawn toward the house that had briefly felt less lonely and now felt like a prison of her own careful construction. Eleanor was crossing the corridor from the schoolroom to her small chamber on the afternoon of the 22nd of May, arms full of the girls' copybooks that needed reviewing, when Lady Beatrice stepped out from the music room with such calculated precision that Eleanor understood immediately this encounter was not accidental, and the older woman's face held an expression of cold determination that made Eleanor's stomach tighten with dread even before a single word was spoken. "You forget yourself, Miss Fairfax," Beatrice said without preamble, her voice low enough not to carry to the servants, but sharp enough to cut, and Eleanor stood frozen in the dim corridor with its dark panelling and portraits of Ashworth ancestors, looking down in judgment as Thomas's sister continued with the kind of surgical cruelty that only women of a certain class could deliver with such devastating efficiency. "My brother is a duke, one of the highest-ranking peers in England, and you are a governess, a woman without family or fortune or any claim whatsoever to a position in his world. And if you believe for one moment that his temporary kindness to you means anything beyond the sort of charity a good man might show to any creature in his household, then you are deluding yourself in ways that would be pitiable if they were not so grasping and inappropriate. Lady Isabella Pembroke is a woman of quality, born to one of the finest families in England, educated in accomplishments you could never hope to possess, and she is bearing a child who needs a name and the protection of a respected house, and it is my brother's duty to provide that protection through marriage, just as it has always been understood between their families." Beatrice took a step closer, and Eleanor could smell her perfume, something French and expensive that spoke of a world Eleanor would never inhabit, and the expression on the older woman's face held not anger exactly, but something worse, a kind of dismissive certainty that Eleanor was so far beneath consideration that this conversation itself was an act of condescension. "Your plainness and low birth make you invisible to men of his station, except as objects of charity or Christian duty, Miss Fairfax. And if you possess any dignity at all, you will remove yourself from situations where you might be mistaken for something you can never be. Because the scandal you are courting through your presumption will not harm my brother in the end, but it will destroy you utterly and leave you without position or character or any hope of employment in a respectable house ever again." Eleanor stood perfectly still during this speech, her arms aching from the weight of the copybooks, her face carefully composed in the neutral expression she had perfected over years of enduring dismissal. And she said with a voice that did not shake, "I have never forgotten my position, Lady Beatrice, and I have never presumed anything beyond what has been freely offered." But Beatrice cut her off with a sharp gesture and said, "Then you will understand that what has been freely offered must now be freely declined if you have any care for my brother's welfare or your own survival in this world." And with that, she swept past Eleanor toward the drawing-room, leaving the faint trail of French perfume and the weight of her words hanging in the corridor like poison. Eleanor made her way to her chamber somehow, closed the door, set down the copybooks with hands that trembled only slightly, and stood at the small window looking out over the gardens where she had walked with Thomas just yesterday. And though she maintained her composure, she felt something breaking inside her that had already been cracked and now simply shattered under the weight of truth she had always known, but had foolishly allowed herself to forget. That evening she did not go to the orangery, despite knowing Thomas would be waiting, could not bear to see him, and pretend nothing had changed when everything had been laid so brutally bare. But as the sky darkened toward full night, she heard footsteps in the corridor outside her door, too heavy to be a maid, and then a quiet knock that she recognized immediately. And when she opened the door, Thomas stood there still dressed for dinner, with an expression of such concern and determination that she nearly closed the door again, simply to protect herself from what she knew was coming. "What has changed, Eleanor?" he said without greeting, stepping into her small room in a breach of propriety so complete that any servant seeing him would have grounds for her immediate dismissal, and she backed away from him into the tiny space dominated by her narrow bed and single chair, and said with careful steadiness, "You must do your duty to Lady Isabella. Your family expects it, and society expects it, and she needs you, and I will not be the obstacle to what is right and proper." He looked as though she had struck him, his face going pale in the candlelight, and he said, "What if my duty lies elsewhere? What if everything I have been told about duty and obligation and proper behavior has been wrong, and the only duty that matters is the duty I owe to my own heart and to the one person who has made me feel truly alive for the first time in my adult life?" And Eleanor felt tears burning behind her eyes, but did not let them fall as she said, "I am a governess, Thomas. I have nothing. I am nothing." And he crossed the small space between them and took her hands and said with fierce intensity, "You are everything, and I will make you understand that if it takes the rest of my life." Thomas began openly defying every expectation the household and society had carefully constructed around him with a deliberate determination that both terrified and exhilarated Eleanor in equal measure, and she watched in stunned disbelief as the man who had spent his entire adult life performing duty with flawless precision suddenly abandoned propriety as though it had never held any claim on him at all. On the morning of the 24th of May, he appeared in the schoolroom during Latin lessons with Clara and Sophia, not to observe briefly as he had done before, but to settle himself in the chair by the window and remain for the entire morning, answering questions and laughing at the girls' mistakes, and praising Eleanor's teaching methods with such open warmth that both his nieces stared at him with delighted confusion, and Eleanor felt her face burning as she tried to maintain some semblance of professional composure. He began joining their afternoon walks through the gardens, not concealing himself or maintaining any pretense of accidental encounter, but simply appearing at the appointed hour and offering Eleanor his arm in full view of the drawing-room windows, where Isabella and Beatrice took tea and could observe every moment of this shocking breach of social order. The servants began to whisper with an intensity that made Eleanor's skin prickle whenever she passed through the corridors, and she caught fragments of scandalized conversation about the Duke showing particular attention to the governess, while a lady of quality sat neglected in the guest chambers, and she knew that every person in the household was watching them now with either horror or fascination, and that there would be consequences she could not yet imagine. But that filled her with dread. Isabella's demeanor shifted from gracious tragedy to something harder beneath the surface charm, and Eleanor saw it one afternoon when she encountered Lady Pembroke in the upper corridor, and the beautiful woman looked at her with eyes that held pure calculation and said with honeyed venom, "How clever you are, Miss Fairfax, to have entrapped a duke's attention through whatever means you have employed. But such tricks never hold men of his station for long, and you will find yourself cast aside when he remembers what is owed to his name and his position." Beatrice increased her campaign of pressure and disapproval, appearing at breakfast to lecture Thomas about responsibility and the scandal he was courting and the damage he was doing to the family reputation, but Thomas simply continued eating his breakfast and said with maddening calm, "I appreciate your concern, Beatrice, but I am quite capable of managing my own affairs," which only made his sister more furious and more determined to separate him from Eleanor by any means necessary. The other servants, the footmen and maids and stable hands, divided into camps as the household polarized around the unfolding drama, and Eleanor discovered unexpected allies among those who had watched her quiet kindness to the children and to the lower staff over the past 3 years, while others made their disapproval clear through cold stares and deliberate rudeness that Thomas noticed and addressed with swift discipline that shocked everyone accustomed to his patient leadership. One afternoon in early June, Eleanor was in the library retrieving a volume on English history when Thomas entered and closed the door behind him with an expression of such intensity that she set down the book with trembling hands, and he crossed to where she stood by the window overlooking the rose garden and said without preamble, "If circumstances were different, Eleanor, if you were free of all expectations and I of all obligations, if we existed in a world where only our own hearts mattered, what would you want?" And she felt her carefully constructed walls crumbling like sand castles before tide as she whispered, "I would want impossible things, Thomas. I would want a life I have no right to imagine." He stepped closer until she could feel the warmth of him and see the way his eyes held both determination and vulnerability, and he said, "What if they are not impossible? What if the only thing that makes them impossible is our own fear of defying a world that has never cared for our happiness anyway?" And Eleanor felt something breaking open inside her chest, some final resistance dissolving, as she met his gaze and allowed him to see for the first time the full depth of what she felt and had tried so desperately to hide. Eleanor learned what had transpired at dinner on the evening of the 8th of June, not through her own presence at that formal meal, for governesses did not dine with the family, but through the breathless accounts of 3 different servants who appeared at her door in succession over the course of that night, each more scandalized than the last, and from their fractured narratives she pieced together the dramatic scene that had unfolded in the candlelit dining room where Thomas had sat at the head of the long mahogany table with Isabella to his right and Beatrice to his left, and 6 guests from neighboring estates arranged along the sides, all of whom had come with barely concealed curiosity about the situation between the Duke and the beautiful fallen lady residing in his house. Isabella had apparently waited until the fourth course, when wine had loosened tongues and the conversation had turned to matters of duty and family obligation. And then she had set down her fork with trembling hands and begun to weep with such artful despair that every eye turned to her, and she had spoken in a voice breaking with emotion about her ruined state and the cruelty of the Comte, who had promised her the world and then died and left her bearing his child with no protection and no future, and how she had come to Ravensmere in desperate hope, because she remembered the attachment she and Thomas had shared in their youth when their families had expected a betrothal that would unite two great houses. She had spoken of the shame she carried, and how she could not bear to burden Thomas any longer with her presence, and she announced with tragic nobility that she would leave on the morrow and face her disgrace alone and spare him the difficulty of her situation. And the servants reported that several of the female guests had been dabbing their eyes, and the men had looked grave and meaningful, and everyone had turned to Thomas expectantly, waiting for him to do the honourable thing and offer marriage to rescue this lady of quality from her desperate circumstances. But Thomas had simply sat in silence for a long moment, looking at Isabella with an expression the footman could not quite read, and then he had said in a voice perfectly clear and steady that carried to every corner of that dining-room, "I will provide for you and your child completely, Isabella, a house of your own choosing with sufficient income to live in comfort and respectability, and my protection such that no one will dare speak against you. But I will not marry you, because I do not love you, and you do not love me. You loved the Comte, and chose him over everything else, and I have recently come to understand what love truly is, because I have come to love another." The servants reported that the dining-room had erupted in shocked whispers and gasps, that Isabella's face had gone white with fury beneath her carefully maintained expression of tragic surprise, that Beatrice had risen from her chair and demanded to know who this other person was, with a tone that suggested she already knew and was horrified, and that Thomas had simply said, "That is my concern, and hers alone, but you will know soon enough," and then he had excused himself from the table while the guests dissolved into excited gossip that would be all over the county by morning, and Isabella sat frozen in her chair with her hands clenched in her lap and her eyes blazing with humiliation and rage that she could no longer disguise beneath her performance of gentle sorrow. Thomas came to Eleanor's small chamber on the night of June 8th, after the household had fallen into shocked and restless silence, and propriety that had governed every interaction between them until now was abandoned completely as he climbed the narrow servants' staircase to the third floor, where the governess' quarters were located, in rooms so modest they might have belonged to the scullery maid, and when his knock came at her door near midnight, Eleanor was surrounded by half-filled trunks and scattered possessions because she was packing with hands that shook and tears that would not stop falling, certain that she would be dismissed before dawn to contain the scandal that his dinner declaration had unleashed, and knowing that she was the unnamed cause of the upheaval that would now consume his life and his reputation. She opened the door in her plain night-dress, with a shawl clutched around her shoulders and her hair loose down her back, and the impropriety of him seeing her this way and being in her private chamber at this hour would have horrified her just weeks ago, but now seemed insignificant compared to the disaster unfolding around them. And when she saw his face in the dim candlelight, she saw that he looked as though he had been fighting a battle that had taken everything from him, his formal dinner clothes disheveled, and his cravat loosened, and his dark hair disarranged as though he had been running his hands through it for hours. He stepped into the small room and closed the door behind him and took in the scene of her packing with an expression that moved from confusion to understanding to something like anguish. And he said, "What are you doing, Eleanor?" And she could barely speak through the tears that had started again, as she gestured helplessly at the trunks and whispered, "I will be dismissed, Thomas. Beatrice will see to it, and even if she does not, your position requires it. I am the scandal now, and the only way to contain the damage is for me to disappear, and I should never have allowed myself to hope for anything different, because I knew what I was and what you are, and the impossible distance between those two realities." He crossed the small space between them in 2 strides and took her hands in his, and the warmth of his touch after the cold certainty of loss made her sob harder, and he said with a voice rough with emotion, "I have loved you for weeks, Eleanor, perhaps from that first morning in the orangery, when I found you among the lemon trees, and you looked at me not as a duke, but as a man who needed the peace of that beautiful space as much as you did. I love your mind that sees connections and beauty where others see only facts. I love your gentleness with my nieces and the way you speak to servants with the same respect you show to ladies. I love your quiet strength that has endured years of invisibility without becoming bitter or small. I love the way you see beauty in a perfect leaf, or a line of poetry, or the particular quality of morning light, and I love who I am when I am with you, because you see past the title and the duty to the person I actually am beneath all of that." Eleanor was weeping so hard she could barely breathe as she shook her head and said, "I am no one, Thomas. I have nothing to bring to a marriage with you, no fortune or family or beauty or social position. I will ruin you and destroy your standing and make you an object of ridicule and pity." And he pulled her closer and said, "You are everything, Eleanor. You have made me understand what love truly is after 32 years of not knowing, not obligation or suitability or the arrangement of fortunes and names, but recognition. The profound gift of being truly seen by another person and seeing them in return. And is that not rare beyond all measure? Is that not worth any price the world might demand we pay for it?" But Eleanor's fear remained even after his declaration of love on that midnight hour in her small chamber, and though her heart had broken open when he said those words she had longed to hear, the harsh light of morning on June 9th brought with it the cold certainty of social impossibility, the scandal that would follow them like a shadow, the ruin that would attach to his name because of her. And when Thomas came to the schoolroom that afternoon while Clara and Sophia were at their drawing lesson with the visiting art master, she told him with a voice that shook but did not break that she could not accept his love, could not be the cause of his destruction, could not watch him lose the respect of his peers and the stability of his position, because he had made the catastrophic error of caring for a governess with no beauty or fortune or name to recommend her. He looked as though she had struck him, his face going pale and then flushing with emotion as he said her name like a plea. But she held firm even as her heart tore itself apart, and she said, "I will not be the instrument of your ruin, Thomas." And he left without another word, because he would not force what she would not freely give. The days that followed were the most miserable Eleanor had ever known, worse even than the weeks after Isabella's arrival, because then she had been returning to familiar resignation, but now she was losing something she had briefly held and tasted and allowed herself to believe might be real. Isabella departed for the house in Sussex that Thomas had arranged for her on June 11th, but not before spreading poison wherever she went, telling anyone who would listen about the Duke's inexplicable and surely unnatural infatuation with a plain governess, who must have used manipulation or perhaps even witchcraft to ensnare him, suggesting that Miss Fairfax had calculatedly positioned herself in his path and played on his sympathy with false modesty and invented intelligence. The story spread through the county like fire through dry grass, and society turned the matter into delicious scandal, the fallen topic of every tea party and evening gathering, and callers came to Ravensmere on the flimsiest pretexts hoping to catch a glimpse of the governess who had somehow bewitched a duke. Beatrice cornered Eleanor in the corridor outside the schoolroom on the morning of June the 13th and delivered a cold ultimatum with eyes like flint. Leave quietly within the week, and I will provide a modest reference that allows you to secure another position, or be dismissed publicly with no reference at all, and face destitution, because I will not allow my brother to destroy himself over a woman so far beneath him that the match is an insult to everything our family represents. Eleanor agreed to go, because she had known from the beginning that this was how it would end, had tried to protect herself against exactly this outcome, and she began packing her few belongings with hands that trembled and eyes that would not stop producing tears, no matter how she tried to master them. Clara and Sophia wept when she told them she was leaving, clung to her and begged her to stay, and she held them and told them they had been the great joy of her 3 years at Ravensmere, and she would carry them in her heart always. On the morning of June 15th, the day before her scheduled departure, Eleanor rose before dawn and made her way one final time to the orangery, to say goodbye to the place where she had been happy, where she had discovered that love was real, even if it could not be hers to keep. Thomas was there in the orangery on the morning of June 15th, as though he had known she would come, standing among the lemon trees in the same spot where they had first spoken months ago when their acquaintance was new and the possibility of love had seemed as distant as stars, and the dawn light filtered through the glass panels and through the glossy leaves in patterns of gold and green that dappled his face and made the whole space feel suspended between night and day, between ending and beginning. He looked as though he had not slept in the days since she had refused his love, his face drawn and shadowed with exhaustion, his dark hair disheveled, and his clothing less immaculate than usual. And when he saw her enter through the door from the garden path, he did not move toward her, but simply stood watching her with an expression of such raw longing and despair that Eleanor felt her heart crack open all over again, despite her determination to remain strong through this final goodbye. She stopped just inside the doorway with her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders against the morning chill, and her hands gripping the fabric as though it could anchor her against the storm of feeling that threatened to sweep away the last remnants of her resolve. And for a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the space filled with plants they had both tended and loved, across the impossible distance between Duke and governess that society insisted must remain unbridgeable. Then Thomas spoke, and his voice was rough with emotion and sleeplessness as he said, "I have spent my entire life doing what was expected of me, Eleanor, being who I was supposed to be according to the accident of my birth, and the responsibilities that came with it. My brother died when I was 24 years old, and I inherited a dukedom I had never been prepared for, and duty that weighed on me like iron, and I performed it faithfully because that is what one does. One carries the burden one is given without complaint, and without considering whether there might be any other way to live. But I have been half alive all these years, Eleanor, moving through days that blurred into each other without meaning or joy or any sense of actually inhabiting my own existence. And then I found you in this orangery one morning, and you looked at me as though I were simply a man who needed peace rather than a title that required deference. And slowly over these months you woke me from the sleep I had been living in. You made me remember what it feels like to be truly present in a moment, to laugh without restraint, to share thoughts that matter, to be seen for who I actually am beneath all the performance and expectation. I would rather face scandal with you, face society's judgment and gossip and withdrawal, face whatever consequences come from choosing love over duty, than live a lifetime of hollow respectability without you, going through motions that mean nothing with a woman I do not love, while knowing that the only person who ever truly understood me is somewhere in the world alone, because I was too cowardly to claim her." If you leave this morning, I will not stop you. I will not force what you will not freely give, but know this truth before you go. I will not marry another, not Isabella or any suitable lady my family might present. I will remain alone for the rest of my life, because you are the only person I have ever truly loved. And I would rather have the memory of what we shared in this orangery than a lifetime of comfortable lies with someone else. Eleanor felt the tears she had been fighting stream down her face as the walls she had built around her heart to protect herself from exactly this kind of hope crumbled completely, and she heard herself say in a voice that shook but did not break, "I love you, Thomas. I have tried so hard not to, because I knew it was foolish and impossible and could only lead to pain. But I love you beyond reason, beyond sense, beyond any consideration of wisdom or self-preservation. And if you truly mean what you are saying, then I cannot leave. I cannot walk away from the only real happiness I have ever known, even though I am terrified of what it will cost us both." Thomas moved then across the space between them that had felt like an unbridgeable chasm just moments before, and Eleanor found herself stepping forward as well, until they met in the center of the orangery beneath the canopy of lemon trees they had both tended with such care these past months. And then he was lowering himself to his knees on the stone floor in a gesture of such profound humility that Eleanor gasped and reached for him instinctively, though her hands were shaking so badly she could barely control them. The dawn had broken fully now, and golden light poured through the glass panels overhead and through the glossy green leaves to dapple them both in patterns of brightness and shadow. And Thomas looked up at her with his face transformed by hope and vulnerability, as he took both her hands in his and said, "Eleanor Fairfax, I am asking you to marry me, to become my wife and my partner in everything that life brings, to face with me whatever storms society throws at us, because I know in the deepest part of my soul that our love is worth any cost we might have to pay. I cannot promise you that the path ahead will be easy. I cannot tell you that there will not be those who judge you harshly, or who whisper cruel things, or who refuse to accept you as Duchess. But I can promise you that I will stand beside you always, that I will never regret choosing love over duty, that I will spend the rest of my life making sure you know how valued and cherished and seen you are. I offer you everything I have and everything I am, not the title or the estate or the position, though those come with me and will be yours as well, but rather this heart that has been sleeping for so long until you woke it, this life that had become hollow until you filled it with meaning, this self that had forgotten what it felt like to be truly known by another person. Will you marry me, Eleanor? Will you take this leap into the unknown with me and trust that love is enough foundation to build a life on even when the world tells us we are foolish?" Eleanor was crying in earnest now, tears streaming down her face as she looked at this man who was offering her not just marriage, but recognition, not just security, but partnership, not just a position, but love that saw her as she truly was. And she heard herself say yes in a voice that broke with emotion but was absolutely certain. "Yes, I will marry you, Thomas. Yes, with all my heart and soul, yes." He rose, then, and pulled her into his arms, and they held each other as the orangery filled with golden morning light that seemed to bless them. And Eleanor thought of how this space had been her sanctuary when she was alone and invisible, and how now it was becoming the place where her new life began, where love had been cultivated like the lemon trees around them, through patient tending and faithful care, until it bore fruit beyond anything she had dared to imagine. Their first kiss was tentative at first, Thomas cupping her face in his hands with such gentleness as though she were something precious that might break, and then deepening as years of loneliness and longing dissolved between them, and they discovered the taste and feel of each other with wonder, and when they finally drew apart, they were both breathless and smiling through tears. Thomas reached into his waistcoat pocket and drew out a ring that caught the light and sparkled with simple elegance, a band of gold set with a single perfect sapphire, and he told her as he slipped it onto her finger that it had been his mother's ring, and he had carried it for days in his pocket, hoping against hope that she would accept it. And Eleanor looked at it on her hand and felt the weight of it as both promise and reality, the tangible proof that this was actually happening. Thomas moved with astonishing speed in the days that followed their engagement, summoning his solicitor from London within hours of leaving the Orangery that dawn morning, and securing a special license by the following afternoon through connections he had never before employed for personal matters. And by the evening of June 16th, he had made arrangements for a small ceremony to take place in the estate chapel at dawn in just 3 days hence, before opposition could organize or society could interfere with what he had decided was not merely his right, but his deepest necessity. He gathered his household and family in the grand drawing room that same evening, with Eleanor standing beside him in a position of equality that made several of the assembled guests draw sharp breaths, and he announced in a voice that carried absolute authority, and brooked no argument, that he would marry Miss Eleanor Fairfax on the morning of June 19th, and that anyone who could not support this union with genuine goodwill was free to leave his employ or his home immediately without rancor, but also without hope of remaining in his life going forward. The silence that followed was thick with shock and calculation, as Beatrice rose from her chair with her face flushed in anger and humiliation, declaring that she would not remain under a roof where a mere governess was elevated so far above her natural station, and that she would remove her daughters from this scandalous household within the week. But then young Sophia burst into tears and ran to Eleanor, wrapping her arms around her former governess and begging her mother not to take them away from Miss Fairfax, whom they loved more than anyone, and Clara joined her sister in pleading with Beatrice to stay and accept the marriage, and the sight of her daughters clinging to Eleanor with such desperate affection made something crack in Beatrice's rigid composure, though she did not soften entirely, but rather sank back into her chair with a stiff nod that indicated she would remain even if she could not yet bring herself to approve. Several of the younger servants, who had only recently joined the household staff, gave notice that very evening, unwilling to serve a duchess of such questionable origins, and the head footman, who had been with the family for 15 years, departed with expressions of disgust that cut Eleanor deeply, despite Thomas's reassurances that such people were not worth her grief. But others among the staff, those who had witnessed the transformation in their master since Eleanor had come into his life, and who had seen the genuine tenderness between them in stolen moments throughout the estate, remained loyal and even enthusiastic. And it was the housekeeper, Mrs. Martha Whitmore, who spoke for this faction when she approached Eleanor in the corridor outside the drawing-room after the announcement, and took her hands with warmth and said, "I have watched you both these past months, Miss Fairfax, and what you share is real love, such as I have rarely seen in all my years of service in great houses where marriages are made for every reason except affection, and it is about time this house had some genuine feeling in it, rather than just duty and cold respectability." The estate polarized rapidly over the following hours, as word spread beyond the household to the village and the neighboring families, and Eleanor found herself facing both unexpected cruelty and equally unexpected support from quarters she had not anticipated, receiving a vicious letter from a lady she had ever met, calling her a scheming adventuress, while also finding a basket of preserves left at the kitchen door by a tenant farmer's wife, with a note saying that love deserved celebration regardless of station. The days between the announcement and the wedding passed in a strange, suspended state, where Eleanor felt simultaneously more exposed and more protected than she had ever been in her life. As cruel letters arrived daily at Ravensmere from society matrons who had never acknowledged her existence before, but now took it upon themselves to warn the Duke against his ruinous infatuation with a fortune-hunting governess of no breeding and less beauty, while other messages came from families who quietly withdrew their invitations and made clear that a duchess of such questionable origins would not be welcome in their homes or their circles. But through it all, Thomas never wavered for even a moment, his certainty becoming the foundation on which Eleanor built her own fragile courage, and he insisted they plan the ceremony together in the evenings after the household had settled, sitting close, together in the library with their heads bent over details that felt both momentous and intimate. They decided on simplicity rather than grandeur, just family and the loyal staff members who had chosen to remain at Ravensmere despite the scandal, and when Eleanor confessed with embarrassment that she had no wedding finery suitable for becoming a duchess, that her only good dress was the grey silk she wore for Sunday services in the village, it was Mrs. Whitmore who approached her the following morning with tears in her eyes and a confession that she and several of the maids who supported the match had taken it upon themselves to alter a gown that had belonged to Thomas's mother, a beautiful creation of ivory silk and delicate lace that had been preserved in tissue paper for decades, waiting for just such an occasion. Eleanor wept when she tried it on, and found that with the alterations it fit her perfectly, transforming her in ways she had not thought possible, and when Thomas saw her standing in the doorway of the sewing room where the maids had been working, he went very still, and then crossed to her and took her hands, and told her she was beautiful, in a voice that made her believe it might actually be true. He showed her the Duchess's chambers on the second day, the suite of rooms that would become hers after the wedding, and asked if she wanted to change anything about the furnishings or the arrangement, giving her authority over spaces that seemed impossibly grand to someone who had lived in a small attic room for years. And when she stood in the center of the sitting room, feeling overwhelmed by the reality that she would actually be Duchess of Ravensmere, he came to stand behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist and reminded her gently that she would be his wife first and foremost, that the title was secondary to the relationship they were building, and that was all that truly mattered. On the evening before the wedding, they walked through the gardens together as the sun set and painted everything gold and amber, and they talked about the future they would build together, the children they hoped would come in time, the life of genuine partnership and mutual respect that seemed possible now in ways Eleanor had never imagined. And Thomas told her that whatever difficulties they faced from society or family, he would face them gladly, because a life with her was worth any price, and Eleanor found herself believing him, and believing in the possibility of happiness that had seemed impossible just weeks before. The wedding took place on the morning of June 19th, not in the estate chapel as originally planned, but in the orangery, where their love had first taken root and grown toward light, Eleanor having made this request the evening before when she and Thomas walked the gardens, and she confessed that the chapel felt too grand and formal for what she wanted their marriage to represent, that she would rather speak her vows in the place where she had first allowed herself to hope, and where he had first seen her truly. Dawn was just breaking when the small gathering assembled among the lemon trees and climbing jasmine, the glass panels of the orangery catching the early light and scattering it in golden fragments across the brick floor, and the faces of those who had chosen to stand with them, despite scandal and social consequence. Clara and Sophia served as flower girls, dressed in white muslin with wreaths of roses in their hair, their faces alight with such pure joy that several of the assembled servants had to dab at their eyes before the ceremony even began, and the girls scattered petals along the narrow aisle between the potted trees with solemn importance. Beatrice stood near the front in a gown of severe grey silk, her expression still stony with disapproval, but her presence itself a concession that meant more than Eleanor had expected, and the loyal staff members who had remained at Ravensmere through the tumult of the past weeks filled the remaining space with their witnessing, Mrs. Whitmore most prominent among them, with tears already streaming down her weathered face. Eleanor entered the orangery on no one's arm, since she had no father or brother to perform that role, walking alone in the altered gown of ivory silk and delicate lace that had belonged to Thomas's mother, her hair dressed simply with a few small white roses woven through the dark strands, and in her hands she carried a small bouquet of lemon blossoms, picked fresh that morning from the very trees under which Thomas had proposed just 3 days earlier. Thomas stood waiting near the small iron table where they had shared so many dawn conversations, dressed in formal black tailcoat and ivory waistcoat. And when Eleanor appeared in the doorway, backlit by the rising sun, his expression transformed into something so raw and reverent that she had to pause to steady herself before continuing forward. The vicar from the village church performed the ceremony with warmth, despite his obvious nervousness at officiating such an irregular union, his voice carrying clearly through the glass-enclosed space as he spoke the ancient words about love and commitment and the joining of two souls. And when he invited the couple to exchange their vows, Thomas took Eleanor's hands in his and spoke in a voice that shook only slightly. "I take you as my wife, my partner, my truest companion, the one who has shown me what it means to be fully alive and fully myself." Eleanor responded with her own vows, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I take you as my husband, my home, my heart's recognition, the one who saw me when I believed myself invisible and loved me when I thought myself unworthy of love." Thomas slipped his mother's ring onto her finger, where it had rested since the proposal, the gold warm and solid and real, and then the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, and granted Thomas permission to kiss his bride, and when their lips met in that sun-filled space surrounded by the scent of citrus blossoms and jasmine, it felt like the sealing of something that had been inevitable from that first morning months ago when a lonely duke and an overlooked governess had encountered each other among the lemon trees. The assembled witnesses cheered with genuine enthusiasm as Eleanor became the Duchess of Ravensmere, and even Beatrice was seen to dab at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, though she maintained her rigid posture throughout. The wedding breakfast took place in the morning room, where sunlight poured through tall windows and illuminated the simple but elegant arrangement that Mrs. Whitmore and the loyal staff had prepared in just 3 days, with white linens covering the long table and arrangements of roses and jasmine, creating pools of color and fragrance that transformed the everyday space into something that felt both festive and intimate. And though the gathering was small, it possessed a warmth and genuine joy that Eleanor suspected many grander society weddings lacked entirely. Clara and Sophia could hardly contain their excitement, the girls having abandoned all pretense of the dignified behavior their mother usually demanded as they pressed close to Eleanor on either side, and peppered her with questions about what it felt like to be a duchess now, and whether she would still teach them their lessons, and if Uncle Thomas would finally smile more often the way he had been doing these past weeks. And Eleanor answered each question with patience and affection, while Thomas sat beside her with his hand resting possessively over hers on the table, in a casual display of intimacy that would have been unremarkable in a common couple, but felt revolutionary coming from a duke who had always maintained such careful propriety. The loyal servants who had chosen to remain at Ravensmere, despite scandal and social pressure, served the breakfast with obvious pleasure, their faces reflecting a satisfaction that seemed to come from witnessing love triumph over the rigid expectations that governed their world as much as it governed the lives of their employers. And when Mrs. Whitmore stood to offer a toast, Her weathered face was wet with tears as she spoke in a voice that trembled only slightly about how she had served the Ashworth family for 40 years and had seen both joy and sorrow within these walls, but that she had never seen anything quite so transformative as the love between the Duke and his new Duchess, how it had changed the very atmosphere of the house from one of cold duty to one of genuine warmth, proving that love could indeed transform a house into a home if the people within it had courage enough to choose authenticity over appearance. Thomas rose then to offer his own toast, thanking each person present by name for the courage it had taken to stand with them when society and expectation had demanded they turn away, acknowledging that loyalty in the face of scandal required a strength of character that he would not forget, and that he hoped to prove worthy of through the life he and Eleanor would build together at Ravensmere. And his voice carried such sincerity that several of the maids dabbed at their eyes with their aprons, while the footman stood straighter with obvious pride. Eleanor found herself rising as well, though she had not planned to speak, but the moment seemed to demand it as she looked around at the faces of those who had supported her transformation from invisible governess to duchess. And in a voice that grew steadier as she continued, she thanked them for their kindness and their faith, promising that she would work every day to be worthy of the position she now held, and to bring whatever good she could to Ravensmere and to the families who depended on the estate, speaking from her heart about her hope that this household might become a place where people were valued for their character rather than their rank, where love and loyalty mattered more than birth and beauty. Beatrice, who had maintained her stony silence through most of the breakfast, suddenly cleared her throat and spoke in a voice that lacked its usual sharp edge, admitting with obvious difficulty that her daughters loved Eleanor, and that such love was not given lightly by children who were generally quite discerning in their affections, and that perhaps she herself had been too harsh in her judgments, too quick to value convention over genuine feeling. And while she could not promise to understand the choice her brother had made, she could at least acknowledge that she had never seen him happier than he had been these past weeks. Eleanor accepted this olive branch with grace, rising to embrace her new sister with genuine warmth that seemed to surprise them both. And the day continued in this manner, with the tension that had marked the previous weeks gradually dissolving into something that felt almost like hope, as though this small gathering had created a pocket of possibility where the normal rules might be rewritten and where love might actually be enough to build a life upon. The morning suspended in golden light that seemed to bless their unlikely union and promise that perhaps impossible things could become real after all. The leaves had turned from summer green to amber and crimson by the time autumn settled over Ravensmere in October of 1819, and in those 6 months since the dawn wedding in the orangery, Eleanor had transformed from a hesitant new bride into a woman who moved through the halls and grounds of the estate with quiet confidence that came not from arrogance, but from the steady certainty that she was loved and that her presence mattered beyond what she had ever imagined possible in those grey days when she had been merely the governess nobody noticed. The initial scandal that had erupted after her marriage to Thomas had not disappeared entirely, but had faded into something more manageable as the surrounding gentry observed that the Duke of Ravensmere seemed genuinely happy for perhaps the first time in memory, that his new Duchess, despite her plain features and common birth, possessed an intelligence and grace that made her genuinely worthy of respect, and that the household at Ravensmere had taken on an atmosphere of warmth and purpose that it had lacked during all the years when duty, rather than love, had governed its operations. Eleanor had surprised herself by discovering that she possessed a natural talent for the responsibilities of her new position, having implemented a series of educational programs for the children of the estate workers that brought her into regular contact with the tenant families and earned their deep affection, and she had taken particular interest in improving the conditions of the small school in the nearby village. where she had begun teaching twice weekly, despite Thomas's gentle protests that a duchess need not trouble herself with such work, to which she always responded that teaching was not trouble, but joy, and that she would not abandon it simply because her circumstances had changed. Isabella Pembroke had married a wealthy merchant from Manchester in late summer, and had removed to that city where Eleanor hoped she had found some measure of contentment, and while there were still those in society who whispered about the Duke's inexplicable choice and the governess who had somehow ensnared him, such talk had lost its vicious edge as months passed and the marriage demonstrated its solidity. Beatrice had undergone perhaps the most remarkable transformation of all, having shifted from hostile opponent to genuine friend as she witnessed how Eleanor's presence had brought light back into her brother's life, and how Clara and Sophia flourished under the continued care and education that Eleanor provided despite her new duties. And the two women now took tea together most afternoons in comfortable companionship that would have seemed impossible during those tense weeks before the wedding. On this particular October morning, Eleanor stood in the orangery where everything had begun, her hand resting lightly on her abdomen, where the small swell of pregnancy was just beginning to show beneath the elegant mourning dress she wore, the evidence of the child she and Thomas had created in the months of their marriage, filling her with a wonder that still felt dreamlike in its improbability. Thomas was beside her among the lemon trees that bore fruit now from the careful tending they had both provided, and he read aloud from a botanical journal about new cultivation techniques, while Eleanor listened with her head resting against his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of citrus blossoms and the deeper scent of his cologne that had become as much home to her as any physical place could be. The morning light filtered through the glass panels exactly as it had on that dawn 6 months earlier when they had spoken their vows, and Eleanor reflected that she had moved through these months in a state of sustained astonishment at how thoroughly her life had changed, how she who had been invisible had become cherished, how she who had expected nothing had been given everything that mattered. But mostly she marveled at the quiet, everyday happiness that filled her days now, the simple contentment of sharing breakfast with her husband and working beside him to improve the lives of those who depended on the estate and planning for the child who would arrive in spring, the life she had never dared to imagine because hoping for impossible things had seemed like a path to certain heartbreak, but which had somehow become her reality anyway. The orangery blazed with spring sunlight on the morning of April the 12th, 1821, exactly 2 years after the dawn, when Eleanor had first encountered Thomas among the lemon trees and begun a transformation she could never have imagined in those days when she had moved through Ravensmere as an invisible governess resigned to the margins of life. And now she sat on the small iron bench with her infant son William cradled against her shoulder while she hummed softly and watched the play of light through the glass panels overhead, her heart so full of contentment that she sometimes had to pause and marvel that this life was truly hers, and not some dream from which she would wake to find herself back in that narrow room under the eaves, with nothing before her but duty and obscurity. The sound of voices and laughter drew her attention to the doorway where Thomas appeared with Clara and Sophia on either side of him, the girls now 12 and 14 and blossoming into lovely young women who had retained all their affection for Eleanor despite her elevation from governess to aunt by marriage, and they rushed forward to peek at baby William and exclaim over how much he had grown in just the few days since they had last visited from the dower house where Beatrice now lived, in surprising contentment with her daughters, and a newfound warmth toward the sister she had once tried to exile. Thomas crossed to Eleanor and bent to kiss her forehead before settling beside her with his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him with the easy intimacy of 2 years of marriage that had only deepened as they had navigated society's judgment together and built a life rooted not in duty or appearance, but in genuine love and partnership, and she reflected, as she often did, on the strangeness of her journey from that resigned, plain woman who had expected nothing to this cherished wife and mother, whose opinions Thomas sought on estate matters, and whose educational programs had transformed the lives of tenant children across Ravensmere. But the true transformation she understood now had been internal, a slow blooming of self-worth that came not from Thomas loving her, though that had been the catalyst, but from learning to see herself as worthy of love, to recognize that her intelligence and gentleness and capacity for joy had value regardless of whether anyone else acknowledged them. And while Thomas's recognition had awakened her to possibility, it was her own recognition of herself that had allowed her to step fully into the life they now shared. Clara asked if she might hold William, and Eleanor passed the baby to her with a smile, watching the girl's careful tenderness and remembering the child she had been just 2 years ago when everything had seemed impossible. And Thomas squeezed her shoulder and whispered that he loved her, and she turned to meet his eyes with the same wonder she always felt at being truly seen and treasured by another person. This man who had chosen her when the world said he should choose beauty and rank instead. The orangery filled with the sound of Sophia's laughter as William grasped her finger, and Eleanor understood in that moment that she had found what she had never dared to name in those earlier years. Not just love or security, but belonging, the deep, soul-settling knowledge that she was home in this family they were building together among the lemon trees where their story had begun. And as spring light poured through glass and leaf, she sent a silent prayer of gratitude for the courage they had both found to choose love over expectation, to believe that their story mattered even when the world said it should never have been written at all.